In the autumn of 1834, something emerged from the coal mines of Blackwater Ridge, West Virginia, that would challenge everything medical science believed possible about human anatomy and the boundaries between life and death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The discovery would shake the foundations of a small mining community and leave questions that remain unanswered nearly 2 centuries later. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where fog clings to ancient peaks like ghostly fingers, the residents of Millfield discovered twins whose very existence defied the natural order. These were not ordinary conjoined siblings, but something far more mysterious and disturbing. Medical experts who examined them declared their condition impossible. Yet there they were, breathing, moving, and displaying abilities that belonged more to folklore than medical textbooks. What happened in those remote West Virginia hills during the harsh winter of 1834 remains one of America's most puzzling medical mysteries. The official records from Jefferson County speak of extraordinary circumstances surrounding the birth and brief life of these twins, but the complete truth has been carefully hidden from public view for almost 200 years. The coal mining town of Millfield sat nestled between steep mountain ridges in what would later become Jefferson County, West Virginia. In 1834, it was barely more than a collection of wooden shacks and mining equipment clustered. Around the entrance to the Blackwater Ridge mine, the settlement housed roughly 150 souls, most of them miners and their families who had come seeking honest work in the dangerous depths of the earth. Life in Millfield was hard and unforgiving. The men descended into the darkness before dawn and emerged after sunset, their faces black with coal dust and their lungs slowly filling with the fine particles that would eventually claim many of their lives. The women tended small gardens in the rocky soil, preserved food for the long winters, and raised children who would likely follow their fathers into the mines when they came of age. The town's heart was centered around 3 main buildings. Murphy's General Store stood at the Crossroads, a 2-story structure that served as both supply depot and unofficial community center. Sean Murphy, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in 1828, kept careful records of every transaction and every piece of news that filtered through his establishment. His ledgers would later prove crucial in understanding the strange events that unfolded that winter. The Millfield Inn, run by widow Margaret Hayworth, provided lodging for the occasional travelers who found themselves passing through the isolated mountain community. Mrs. Hayworth had lost her husband in a mine collapse 3 years earlier, leaving her to raise 2 young sons while maintaining the only decent accommodation for miles around. Her inn also served as the social gathering place where miners would drink corn whiskey and share stories after their shifts ended. The small Methodist chapel, where Reverend Daniel Patterson delivered sermons to a congregation that struggled with the harsh realities of mountain life, dominated the town square. Patterson had arrived in Millfield in 1832 with dreams of bringing spiritual comfort to the hard-working mining families. However, by the winter of 1834, his faith was being tested by circumstances that challenged everything he believed about divine providence and the natural order of creation. Most families in Millfield lived in simple wooden cabins heated by whatever coal they could scavenge from the mine's waste piles. The more prosperous residents, like mine foreman Robert Collins and his wife Elizabeth, had larger homes with multiple rooms and stone fireplaces. The Collins family employed several local women to help with household duties and childcare, making them one of the more influential families in the small community. Robert Collins was a methodical man who had worked his way up from common miner to supervisory position through careful attention to detail and an ability to keep men working safely in dangerous conditions. His wife Elizabeth was known throughout Millfield for her skill with difficult births and medical emergencies. Having delivered most of the children born in the area over the past 5 years, She served as the community's unofficial midwife and healer. The Collins had 3 children of their own. Thomas, aged 14, already helping with mine operations during summer months. Mary, aged 11, who assisted her mother with medical duties and showed remarkable aptitude for healing work. And young James, just 8 years old, whose curiosity about everything around him often led him to discover things that adults preferred remained hidden. By November of 1834, Millfield was facing challenges that went beyond the typical hardships of mountain life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mine had experienced several dangerous cave-ins during the autumn months, killing 2 miners and injuring several others. Production had slowed dramatically, meaning reduced wages for families already struggling to make ends meet. Worse still, a strange sickness had begun affecting some of the miners, causing weakness, disorientation, and symptoms that Elizabeth Collins had never encountered in her years of medical practice. The illness seemed to affect men who worked in the deepest sections of the mine, particularly those who had been exploring new tunnels in search of richer coal veins. They complained of hearing voices in the darkness, seeing movement in empty tunnels, and experiencing vivid nightmares about things living deep beneath the earth. Several miners had simply stopped showing up for work, claiming the mine was cursed and refusing to explain their sudden fear of entering the tunnels they had worked for years. Dr. William Thornton, the nearest physician, lived 20 miles away in Charlestown and rarely made the difficult journey to Millfield unless summoned for the most serious emergencies. The community had learned to rely on Elizabeth Collins for most medical needs, from setting broken bones to delivering babies to treating the various ailments that plagued mining families. Her knowledge came from practical experience rather than formal training, but her success rate was impressive enough that even Dr. Thornton consulted with her when he did visit the area. It was into this already troubled community that the Henderson family arrived in late November, seeking refuge from creditors and a fresh start in the isolated mountain settlement. Jacob Henderson was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely gray hair and nervous eyes that never seemed to rest on any one thing for very long. His wife, Sarah, was a pale, quiet woman who spoke with a slight accent that no one in Millfield could identify. She was heavily pregnant and clearly near her time when the family arrived at the Millfield Inn seeking temporary lodging. The Hendersons claimed to have traveled from Pennsylvania, where Jacob said he had worked as a clerk in a dry goods store before financial difficulties forced them to seek opportunities elsewhere. They carried few possessions and little money, but Jacob assured Sean Murphy that he expected to find work in the mine and would be able to pay their debts once he began earning wages. There was something about the family that made the townspeople uneasy, though no one could articulate exactly what troubled them about the newcomers. Sarah Henderson rarely spoke to anyone except her husband, and when she did, her voice carried strange undertones that made listeners uncomfortable. She seemed to know things about people that a stranger shouldn't know, commenting on the health of children she had never met and making observations about family relationships that proved unnervingly accurate. More disturbing still were the sounds that came from the Hendersons' room at night, soft chanting or singing in a language that Margaret Hayworth had never heard before. Jacob Henderson found work in the mine quickly, as the recent cave-ins had left the operation short-handed. However, his fellow miners soon began reporting strange incidents when working alongside the newcomer. Tools would disappear and reappear in impossible locations. Strange symbols would appear scratched into tunnel walls overnight. Most unsettling of all, the miners who worked with Henderson began experiencing the same mysterious symptoms that had been affecting the deep tunnel. Crews, hearing voices and seeing movement in empty passages. Mine foreman Robert Collins initially dismissed these reports as superstitious nonsense brought on by the stress of recent accidents and reduced wages. However, As more miners began exhibiting symptoms and productivity continued to decline, he started paying closer attention to the pattern of incidents surrounding Jacob Henderson. Collins was a practical man who believed in logical explanations for everything, but he was also experienced enough to recognize when something was genuinely wrong with his operation. The situation came to a head on December 15th, 1834, when Sarah Henderson went into labor during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. Elizabeth Collins was summoned to assist with the birth, despite the dangerous conditions and her own growing unease about the Henderson family. What she discovered that night would challenge everything she thought she knew about human biology and the natural world. The birth itself was unlike anything Elizabeth had experienced in her years of midwifery. Sarah Henderson showed no signs of pain during labor, instead maintaining an eerie calm that bordered on the supernatural. She spoke continuously in that strange language, her voice taking on rhythms and intonations that seemed to echo strangely in the small room. Most disturbing of all, she seemed to be responding to voices that no one else could hear, carrying on conversations with invisible presences throughout the entire ordeal. When the babies finally emerged, Elizabeth Collins felt her blood turn to ice. These were indeed conjoined twins, but their connection defied every medical principle she had ever learned or observed. They were joined not at the torso or head, as she had seen in medical illustrations, but by what appeared to be a writhing mass of tissue that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, independent of either child's heartbeat. The connecting tissue moved constantly, stretching and contracting like a living creature, and occasionally displayed what looked like tiny faces or hands pushing against its surface from within. The twins that Elizabeth Collins delivered that December night possessed characteristics that violated every natural law she understood. The connecting tissue between them appeared to be alive in ways that defied medical explanation. As she watched in horrified fascination, the writhing mass would occasionally display what looked like miniature limbs pressing outward, as if other beings were trapped within the fleshy bridge that bound the children together. Both infants appeared healthy, despite their impossible anatomy. They breathed normally, their hearts beat steadily, and they responded to stimuli like any newborn children. However, their behavior exhibited patterns that Elizabeth had never witnessed in her years of delivering babies. When one twin cried, the other would remain completely silent, yet both would receive comfort simultaneously. When one was hungry, both would show signs of satisfaction after only one had been fed. Most unnervingly, their eyes moved in perfect synchronization, tracking movements and focusing on objects with an awareness that seemed far beyond that of typical newborns. Sarah Henderson recovered from the birth with supernatural speed, showing no signs of the exhaustion and weakness that normally followed such a difficult delivery. Within hours of giving birth, she was moving around the room with fluid grace, tending to her children with an efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. She spoke to the twins in that same strange language Elizabeth had heard during labor, and the babies would respond with soft sounds that seemed to answer her in kind. Jacob Henderson's reaction to his children was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire situation. When Elizabeth expected him to show shock or concern about their unusual condition, he instead displayed what could only be described as satisfaction. He examined the connecting tissue with the careful attention of someone who had been expecting exactly what he found. His comments about the successful manifestation and the proper alignment of forces made no sense to Elizabeth, but his tone suggested these were not random words, but technical terms he understood completely. Over the following days, as word of the unusual birth spread through Millfield, the community's reaction was swift and troubling. Rather than offering the support and assistance typically provided to new families, the townspeople began to avoid the Henderson residence entirely. Miners who had worked alongside Jacob started refusing to enter tunnels where he was assigned. Children who had played near the inn began experiencing nightmares about writhing shadows and voices calling to them from dark places. Margaret Hayworth, whose inn housed the Henderson family, noticed changes in her establishment that she could not explain. Guests reported strange sounds coming from empty rooms, shadows moving across walls where no light source could create them, and an overwhelming sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The building's temperature seemed to fluctuate wildly, with some rooms becoming unbearably hot, while others grew so cold that water would freeze in basins overnight. Elizabeth Collins found herself drawn back to the Henderson family, despite every instinct telling her to stay away. As the community's medical practitioner, she felt responsible for monitoring the health of the newborn twins. However, each visit revealed new impossibilities that challenged her understanding of human physiology and the natural world. The twins were growing at an accelerated rate that defied normal infant development. Within a week of birth, they displayed motor control and awareness typical of children several months older. Their eyes tracked movement with intelligence that seemed almost adult in its intensity. Most disturbing of all, the connecting tissue between them continued to change and evolve, developing what appeared to be sensory organs and primitive neural networks that functioned independently of either child's nervous system. Dr. William Thornton finally made the treacherous winter journey from Charlestown to examine the twins after receiving increasingly desperate messages from Elizabeth Collins. His arrival in Millfield on December 23rd brought the first formally trained medical opinion to bear on the situation. However, his examination of the Henderson twins left him more baffled and disturbed than Elizabeth had ever seen the normally composed physician. Thornton's medical training at the University of Pennsylvania had exposed him to various forms of human abnormality and congenital conditions. He had studied anatomical texts, observed surgical procedures, and examined patients with conditions that challenged conventional understanding of human development. Nothing in his education or experience had prepared him for what he discovered in the Henderson twins. The connecting tissue between the children displayed characteristics that belonged to no known biological classification. Under magnification. Through his medical lens, Thornton observed what appeared to be multiple circulatory systems operating independently of the twins' normal blood flow. The tissue seemed to process nutrients and oxygen through mechanisms that bore no resemblance to any organ system he had studied. Most troubling of all, the tissue responded to external stimuli with what could only be described as purposeful movement, as if it possessed its own consciousness and will. Thornton's attempts to measure the twins' vital signs yielded results that defied medical logic. Each child displayed normal heart rate, breathing patterns, and reflexes when examined individually. However, when measured simultaneously, their physiological functions showed a synchronization that extended far beyond what could be explained by their physical connection. Their heartbeats would align and separate in complex rhythms that seemed to follow patterns rather than random variation. Their breathing would alternate in ways that suggested a shared respiratory system, despite having clearly separate lungs. The physician's most disturbing discovery came when he attempted to examine the connecting tissue more closely. As his instruments approached the writhing mass, it would recoil and reshape itself to avoid contact. When he finally managed to obtain a small sample for microscopic examination, the tissue displayed cellular structures that bore no resemblance to any human anatomy he had studied. The cells appeared to be in constant motion, rearranging themselves in patterns that suggested purpose and intelligence. Jacob Henderson's response to Dr. Thornton's examination was revealing in ways that raised more questions than answers. Rather than seeking explanations for his children's condition or expressing concern about their health, he seemed primarily interested in whether the physician's findings matched certain criteria he referenced but never fully explained. His questions about neural connectivity, energy transfer efficiency, and dimensional stability made no sense in the context of medical examination, but suggested knowledge of principles that extended far beyond conventional understanding. Sarah Henderson's behavior during the examination was equally unsettling. She monitored every aspect of Thornton's investigation with intense focus, occasionally making comments in that strange language that seemed to direct the twins' responses to various tests. When the physician attempted to separate the children to examine them individually, Sarah became agitated in ways that seemed to go beyond normal maternal protectiveness. Her distress appeared to be connected to the twins' condition in ways that suggested she understood aspects of their physiology that remained hidden from medical observation. The twins themselves displayed reactions to examination that further challenged conventional understanding of infant behavior and consciousness. They seemed aware of Dr. Thornton's presence and purpose in ways that newborn children should not possess. Their movements during testing appeared coordinated and purposeful rather than random infant reflexes. Most unnervingly, they would occasionally fix their synchronized gaze on the physician with expressions that seemed to convey intelligence and evaluation far beyond their apparent age. Mine foreman Robert Collins became increasingly concerned about the impact of the Henderson family's presence on his mining operation. The productivity losses and safety incidents that had begun with Jacob Henderson's arrival were escalating into serious operational problems. Miners were reporting equipment failures that followed no logical pattern, tunnel collapses in areas that had been structurally sound for years, and the discovery of strange markings and symbols carved into rock faces overnight. More troubling were the reports of miners hearing voices and sounds coming from unexplored sections of the mine. These were experienced men who understood the acoustics of underground work and could distinguish between normal settling sounds and genuine anomalies. They described hearing what sounded like infant cries echoing from deep within the earth, coming from tunnels that had never been excavated and areas that should have been completely inaccessible. Collins conducted his own investigation of these reports, descending into the deepest sections of the mine with several of his most trusted supervisors. What they discovered challenged his understanding of geology and mining engineering. New passages had appeared overnight in areas where solid rock had blocked further excavation for months. These tunnels showed no signs of human digging or blasting, but appeared to have been carved by forces that left smooth, almost organic curves in the stone walls. The new passages led deeper into the earth than any previous mining operation had reached, descending at angles that seemed to follow natural fault lines, but in directions that made no geological sense. The air in these tunnels carried strange odors that reminded Collins of organic decay mixed with something metallic and sharp that burned the nostrils and throat. Most disturbing of all, the tunnel seemed to carry sounds from the surface, including what could unmistakably be identified as the cries of the Henderson twins. Elizabeth Collins noticed that her own children were being affected by the presence of the twins in their community. Thomas, Mary, and James began experiencing shared nightmares about underground chambers filled with writhing shadows and voices calling to them in languages they did not understand. The children would wake simultaneously, describing identical dreams with details that were far too consistent to be coincidental. Mary, who had been assisting her mother with medical duties, began displaying knowledge about the Henderson twins that she could not have acquired through normal observation. She would make comments about their condition that demonstrated understanding of their physiology that exceeded even Dr. Thornton's analysis. When questioned about the source of her knowledge, Mary would become confused and unable to explain how she knew things that no one had taught her. Young James made a discovery that would prove crucial to understanding the true nature of what was happening in Millfield. While exploring the areas around the mine entrance, he found a series of symbols carved into trees and rock formations that matched markings the miners had reported finding in the new tunnels. The symbols appeared to form a pattern that extended throughout the surrounding forest, creating what looked like a complex geometric design when viewed from the higher elevations around the town. The symbols themselves were unlike any writing or marking system that anyone in Millfield had ever encountered. They seemed to combine elements that suggested both primitive, pictographic communication and sophisticated mathematical notation. Some symbols appeared to move and change when observed for extended periods, shifting between configurations in ways that created optical illusions or possibly represented actual transformation of the markings themselves. James brought his discovery to his father, who initially dismissed the boy's findings as imagination influenced by the recent strange events. However, when Robert Collins examined the symbols himself, he realized they formed a pattern that corresponded exactly to the layout of the new tunnels that had appeared in the mine. The surface markings seemed to be a map or diagram that showed the underground changes in precise detail, suggesting a connection between the Henderson twins and the geological anomalies that were affecting the mining operation. Dr. Thornton made his final examination of the twins on December 31st, 1834. As the year drew to a close and the strange events in Millfield reached a crescendo that would change the community forever, his findings from this examination were so disturbing that he immediately began making arrangements to contact medical authorities in Baltimore and Philadelphia, hoping to bring additional expertise to bear on a situation that had progressed far beyond his ability to understand or control. The connecting tissue between the twins had continued to evolve throughout the months since their birth, developing structures that bore no resemblance to any known biological form. What had initially appeared to be a simple mass of undifferentiated tissue now displayed clear evidence of specialized organs, neural networks, and sensory apparatus that functioned with increasing sophistication. The tissue seemed to be learning and adapting, developing new capabilities that enhanced its ability to interact with the environment and influence the behavior of both twins. Most alarming was Thornton's discovery that the twins' individual physiologies were becoming increasingly dependent on their shared connecting tissue. Attempts to monitor their separate vital signs revealed that their distinct biological functions were merging into a single, more complex system that operated according to principles that violated fundamental medical understanding. The twins were becoming something that could no longer be classified as two individuals joined by accident of birth, but rather a single entity that happened to possess two sets of human features. The new year brought with it a series of discoveries that would forever alter the understanding of what was truly happening beneath the mountains of Millfield. Young James Collins had become obsessed with mapping the strange symbols he had found throughout the forest, spending hours each day documenting their locations and attempting to decipher their meaning. His methodical approach, inherited from his father's engineering background, led him to realize that the markings formed a precise, geometric pattern that extended far beyond the immediate area around the town. Using a collection of detailed sketches and measurements, James created a comprehensive map that revealed the symbols were arranged in concentric circles radiating outward from the Henderson residence at the Millfield Inn. The pattern suggested not random placement, but deliberate design, as if someone or something had been systematically marking the territory according to a specific plan. Most disturbing was his discovery that new symbols appeared regularly, always in locations that maintained the mathematical precision of the overall design. Robert Collins began his own investigation into the Henderson family's background after receiving disturbing reports from miners who had worked in operations throughout the region. Using his connections with other mine foremen and industry contacts, he discovered that similar incidents had occurred in mining communities across Pennsylvania and Virginia over the past several years. Each incident followed a remarkably consistent pattern that suggested systematic rather than random occurrence. In Coburg, Pennsylvania, during the winter of 1832, a family with the surname Hartwell had arrived just before the birth of unusual twins, who had lived only 3 months before mysteriously disappearing along with their parents. The local mine had experienced unprecedented tunnel collapses and the discovery of unexplained passages that led deeper into the earth than any previous excavation. When spring arrived, The Hartwell family had vanished, leaving behind only strange symbols carved into trees and rocks throughout the surrounding area. Similar incidents had occurred in Beckley, Virginia in 1831 and in Morgantown, Pennsylvania in 1829. Each case involved a family arriving during winter months, the birth of twins with unusual characteristics, mining anomalies that defied geological explanation, and the eventual disappearance of the family, along with any official records of their presence. The pattern suggested that the Henderson family was part of a larger phenomenon that had been occurring throughout the coal mining regions of Appalachia for several years. Dr. Thornton expanded his investigation beyond the immediate medical aspects of the twins' condition, seeking correspondence with colleagues at medical institutions in major cities who might have encountered similar cases. His letters to physicians in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York yielded responses that were both enlightening and deeply troubling. While none of his colleagues had personally examined twins with characteristics identical to those displayed by the Henderson children, several reported hearing whispered discussions about cases that were considered too sensitive for publication. In medical journals, Dr. Marcus Whitmore of Johns Hopkins Medical College responded with particular detail about rumors that had circulated through academic medical circles for the past decade. According to Whitmore, there were unconfirmed reports of children born with anatomical impossibilities that challenged fundamental understanding of human development. These cases were allegedly being studied by a secretive group of researchers who operated outside normal academic channels and published their findings only within a restricted network of investigators. Whitmore's letter included references to a private research foundation that reportedly maintained detailed records of unusual births throughout rural America. This organization allegedly recruited families with extraordinary children, offering financial support and medical care in exchange for participation in research programs that were never publicly disclosed. The foundation's interests seemed to focus particularly on children whose conditions suggested connections to geological or environmental factors that remained poorly understood by conventional science. Elizabeth Collins made her own disturbing discovery while examining the twins during their regular medical checkups. The children's development continued to accelerate far beyond normal infant growth patterns, but their advancement was not limited to physical maturation. They displayed cognitive abilities that suggested awareness and intelligence far exceeding their chronological age. By 6 weeks of age, they were responding to complex verbal instructions and demonstrating problem-solving, skills that belonged to much older children. More troubling was Elizabeth's observation that the twins seemed to be learning from sources beyond their immediate environment. They would demonstrate knowledge of people and places in Millfield that they could not have acquired through normal sensory experience. They appeared to understand conversations conducted in rooms they had never entered and to respond to events occurring in locations throughout the community despite having never left the inn where they resided with their parents. The connecting tissue between the twins had evolved into something that could no longer be described using conventional anatomical terminology. What had initially appeared to be a simple bridge of flesh had developed into a complex organ system that seemed to function as both communication network and sensory apparatus. The tissue displayed structures that resembled neural pathways, but operated according to principles that bore no similarity to human nervous system function. Elizabeth's most shocking discovery came when she realized that the twins' shared tissue was not merely connecting them to each other, but appeared to be establishing connections to other organisms in their environment. Plants in the inn withered or flourished based on their proximity to the children. Animals displayed behavioral changes when brought near the twins, becoming either unusually aggressive or completely docile, depending on species and individual temperament. Margaret Hayworth documented increasingly strange phenomena occurring throughout her inn as the twins' influence expanded beyond their immediate room. Guests reported dreams that seemed too vivid and detailed to be products of normal sleep. These dreams consistently involved underground spaces filled with organic structures that pulsed with their own rhythm and purpose. Visitors would wake with detailed knowledge of tunnels and chambers that matched the new passages being discovered in the mine with impossible accuracy. The inn structure itself began showing signs of change that defied architectural explanation. Walls would be warm to the touch in areas where no heat source existed. Floors would vibrate with rhythms that had no identifiable cause. Most unnervingly, new openings would appear overnight, small gaps in walls and floors that seemed to lead to spaces that should not exist within the building's known dimensions. Sarah Henderson's behavior became increasingly ritualistic as the twins matured. She would spend hours each day arranging objects in complex patterns around their room, creating geometric designs that matched the symbols James Collins had discovered throughout the forest. Her movements during these activities displayed precision and purpose that suggested she was following specific instructions or protocols rather than acting on maternal instinct. Jacob Henderson's role in the mine operations expanded as other workers became increasingly reluctant to enter certain areas of the tunnels. His apparent immunity to the psychological effects that plagued other miners made him valuable to the operation, but his presence seemed to accelerate the geological anomalies that were transforming the underground landscape. Passages would extend themselves overnight in directions where Henderson had been working, always following paths that led deeper into the earth. The mine's production actually increased during this period, as the new tunnels revealed coal deposits of exceptional quality and accessibility. However, the coal extracted from these areas displayed characteristics that set it apart from normal anthracite. When burned, it produced flames that were unusually hot and bright, but the smoke carried odors that reminded workers of organic decay. More disturbing still, the ash left behind after burning contained particles that seemed to move and reorganize themselves when observed under magnification. Reverend Daniel Patterson attempted to provide spiritual guidance to his increasingly troubled congregation, but found his own faith challenged by developments that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of divine providence. His attempts to visit the Henderson family and offer pastoral care resulted in encounters that left him questioning fundamental assumptions about the nature of good and evil in the world. During his first visit to bless the newborn twins, Patterson experienced what he later described as a complete inversion of spiritual awareness. Rather than sensing the presence of divine grace that typically accompanied the blessing of innocent children, he felt surrounded by what could only be characterized as ancient intelligence that predated human understanding of morality and purpose. The twins observed his ministrations with expressions that seemed to evaluate and judge rather than receive spiritual comfort. Patterson's subsequent attempts to research the theological implications of the twins' condition led him to examine religious texts and historical documents that were not part of standard seminary education. His investigations revealed references to children born with characteristics that connected them to forces existing beneath the surface of the natural world. These accounts, found in sources ranging from medieval monastery records to Native American oral histories, described beings who served as bridges between the human realm and older powers that dwelt in the deep places of the earth. The Reverend's research suggested that such births were not random occurrences, but events connected to specific geological and environmental conditions. Areas with extensive underground cave systems, particular mineral compositions, and exposure to what historical sources described as earth energies seemed to create circumstances that allowed for the manifestation of children whose existence challenged normal biological and spiritual laws. Dr. Thornton made contact with the mysterious research foundation referenced in Dr. Whitmore's correspondence, initiating a communication that would ultimately reveal the true scope of what was occurring in Millfield. The foundation, which identified itself only as the Society for Geological Anthropology, responded to his inquiries with remarkable speed and demonstrated detailed knowledge of the Henderson twins, condition that exceeded what Thornton had reported. In his letters, the Society's representatives expressed immediate interest in examining the twins and offered to provide resources and expertise that far exceeded what was available through conventional medical channels. However, their communications included references to research protocols and long-term studies that suggested they viewed the Henderson family not as patients requiring medical care, but as subjects in an ongoing investigation that had been planned well in advance of the twins' birth. The Society's correspondence revealed that they maintained detailed records of similar cases throughout rural America and had been tracking families like the Hendersons for over 2 decades. Their research suggested that the twins represented not an isolated anomaly, but part of a larger phenomenon, connected to geological processes that were occurring throughout the Appalachian Mountain region. The Society's interest seemed focused on understanding how these children might serve as indicators of larger environmental changes that were taking place beneath the surface of the Earth. Mine foreman Collins discovered that the Geological Survey maps of the Blackwater Ridge area showed significant discrepancies when compared to the actual underground topography that miners were encountering. Tunnels and chambers that appeared on official geological surveys from 1828 were found to be blocked by solid rock, while new passages existed in areas that surveys indicated should be completely inaccessible. The changes suggested that the underground landscape was being actively modified by forces that operated outside normal geological processes. Collins organized a comprehensive mapping expedition to document the true extent of the underground changes. Using teams of experienced miners and detailed surveying equipment, he discovered that the new tunnel system extended far beyond the original mine boundaries, creating a complex network that connected to natural cave systems throughout the mountain range. Most disturbing was his finding that the tunnels seemed to be expanding continuously, following patterns that corresponded exactly to the surface symbols that James Collins had been documenting. The expedition's most significant discovery was a large underground chamber located directly beneath the Millfield Inn. This space, which had not existed on any previous geological survey, displayed characteristics that challenged understanding of both natural cave formation and human construction techniques. The chamber walls showed evidence of both natural stone formation and what appeared to be deliberate modification using tools and methods that left no recognizable marks or patterns. Within this chamber, Collins and his team found evidence that the space had been used for purposes that remained unclear but were obviously connected to the Henderson family's presence in Millfield. Stone platforms arranged in geometric patterns matched the symbols found throughout the surface area. Organic materials that appeared to be carefully preserved but were unlike any known biological specimens suggested that the chamber served as both laboratory and ritual space for activities that combined scientific investigation with practices that belonged to no recognized cultural tradition. The arrival of representatives from the Society for Geological Anthropology in mid-February 1835 transformed the situation in Millfield from mysterious anomaly to active crisis. 3 men descended upon the isolated mountain community with equipment and resources that seemed impossibly advanced for the era. Dr. Aldrich Blackwood, who introduced himself as the Society's chief researcher, carried instruments that bore no resemblance to conventional medical or scientific apparatus of the time. Blackwood's examination of the Henderson twins revealed knowledge that far exceeded what any outside observer should have possessed about their condition. He spoke with Jacob and Sarah Henderson in that same strange language that the family had been using since their arrival, conducting detailed discussions that clearly involved technical concepts and procedures that had been planned long before the twins' birth. The examination itself took place in the underground chamber that Robert Collins had discovered, suggesting that the space had been prepared specifically for this purpose. Elizabeth Collins was permitted to observe the examination as the community's medical representative, but what she witnessed challenged every assumption she had developed about the Henderson family's origins and purpose. The twins, now nearly 3 months old, but displaying the physical and cognitive development of children several years older, responded to Blackwood's procedures with understanding and cooperation that indicated previous familiarity with the testing protocols. The connecting tissue between the twins had evolved far beyond anything that could be described using conventional anatomical terminology. Under Blackwood's advanced instruments, the structure revealed itself to be a sophisticated biological interface that was actively gathering and processing information from the surrounding environment. The tissue functioned as both sensory organ and communication device, apparently transmitting data to locations beyond the immediate area through mechanisms that operated outside known principles of biology or physics. Blackwood explained to Elizabeth that the twins represented the successful culmination of research that had been conducted throughout the Appalachian region for over 3 decades. The society had been systematically identifying locations where geological conditions created what he termed dimensional instabilities that allowed for the manifestation of enhanced human variants. The Henderson family were not random arrivals seeking refuge, but carefully selected agents whose genetic characteristics had been modified through processes that Blackwood described as evolutionary acceleration. The twins themselves were not merely unusual children, but experimental subjects, whose development was being monitored and guided according to protocols established by researchers who understood principles of human modification that remained unknown to conventional science. Their rapid maturation and extraordinary capabilities were the intended results of procedures that had been applied before their birth, using techniques that combined advanced medical knowledge with what Blackwood referred to as deep earth energies. Robert Collins confronted Jacob Henderson about his true identity and purpose in Millfield, demanding explanations for the mining anomalies and the transformation of his community. Henderson's response revealed the full scope of what the town had unknowingly become part of since his family's arrival. The geological changes occurring beneath Millfield were not random effects but deliberately engineered modifications, designed to create optimal conditions for the twins' continued development. Henderson explained that his role was to serve as both guardian and facilitator for research that was far more extensive than anything the townspeople had imagined. The symbols that James Collins had discovered throughout the forest were not mysterious markings but precise indicators of a technological system that extended throughout the mountain range. The new tunnels in the mine were not natural formations, but constructed passages that provided access to research facilities that had been operating beneath the Appalachian Mountains for decades. The Society for Geological Anthropology, Henderson revealed, was not a conventional research organization, but a group that had gained access to knowledge and capabilities that originated from sources far older than human civilization. Their research involved studying and replicating biological processes that had been discovered in deep underground environments, where forms of life existed that operated according to principles unknown to surface science. Dr. Thornton demanded to examine the Society's research records and documentation, hoping to understand the medical and scientific basis for what was being done to the Henderson twins. Blackwood's response was to provide access to materials that challenged Thornton's understanding of biology, medicine, and the fundamental nature of life itself. The research documents described techniques for modifying human development that drew upon what the Society called primordial biological templates found in ancient geological formations. These templates, according to the Society's research, represented forms of life that had existed on Earth long before the evolution of current biological systems. The templates contained information that could be used to enhance human capabilities, but accessing this information required exposure to specific environmental conditions that existed only in certain underground locations. The Henderson twins had been developed using these templates, making them hybrid beings that combined human characteristics with capabilities derived from much older life forms. The twins' connecting tissue was revealed to be not merely a biological anomaly but a sophisticated interface that allowed them to access and process information from what the society termed the deep network. This network was described as a planet-wide system of interconnected biological and geological structures that existed far beneath the surface, maintaining communication and coordination functions that had been operating for millions of years before human evolution. Sarah Henderson's role in the research became clear when Blackwood demonstrated that she was not entirely human in the conventional sense. Her apparent pregnancy and the subsequent birth of the twins had been carefully orchestrated procedures designed to introduce the ancient biological templates into human genetic material. She served as both incubator and interface, facilitating the creation of hybrid beings who could function as bridges between surface humanity and the deep network. The strange language that the Henderson family used was revealed to be not a human dialect but a communication system that had been developed to interact with the deep network's information processing capabilities. The twins were being trained to serve as interpreters and facilitators, eventually taking on roles that would expand the society's ability to access and utilize the knowledge contained within the underground biological systems. Margaret Hayworth discovered that her inn had been selected as the location for this research specifically because of its position above geological formations that provided optimal access to the deep network. The structural changes that had been occurring throughout the building were not random effects but deliberate modifications designed to enhance the facility's capability to support the twins' development and the society's research activities. The dreams and psychological effects experienced by guests at the inn were not side effects but intentional conditioning processes designed to prepare selected individuals for potential recruitment into the society's research programs. The vivid underground landscapes that people experience during sleep were not imagination but actual sensory input from the deep network, transmitted through the twins' enhanced capabilities and the modified environmental conditions within the inn. Reverend Patterson confronted Dr. Blackwood about the theological and moral implications of the research being conducted in Millfield. Blackwood's response revealed a worldview that extended far beyond conventional religious or scientific frameworks. He explained that the society's work was based on understanding that human civilization represented only a brief and relatively insignificant episode in Earth's biological history. The deep network and the ancient life forms it supported had been maintaining planetary biological systems for eons before human evolution and would continue long after current surface life forms had disappeared. The Society's research was focused on developing ways for humanity to integrate with these deeper systems, potentially ensuring survival through transitions that would otherwise eliminate all surface life. The Henderson twins represented one approach to this integration, combining human consciousness and capabilities with biological systems that were adapted to function within the deep network's environment. Their development was being monitored to determine whether this hybrid approach could produce beings capable of serving as permanent interfaces between surface humanity and the ancient underground civilizations. Young James Collins made a discovery that revealed the true extent of the Society's operations throughout the region. His detailed mapping of the surface symbols had revealed that they formed not just local patterns, but part of a much larger network that extended throughout multiple states. The symbols served as indicators for underground facilities where similar research was being conducted, using different approaches but working toward the same ultimate goal of human integration with the deep network. The mining operations throughout the Appalachian region were not primarily focused on coal extraction, but were serving as cover for excavation projects designed to provide access to deep network facilities. The Society had been using mining companies and isolated communities as unwitting support systems for research that required both secrecy and extensive underground access. Robert Collins organized the community's response to these revelations, attempting to coordinate resistance to what he now understood was not simply unusual research but an active transformation of human beings and their environment according to principles that threatened everything he considered fundamental to human nature and society. However, his efforts were complicated by the discovery that several community members had already been recruited or modified by the society's procedures. The psychological conditioning that had been occurring throughout Millfield had been more extensive and effective than anyone had realized. Multiple families showed signs of modification that indicated they had been systematically prepared for integration into the society's research programs. Children displayed capabilities that exceeded normal human development, while adults demonstrated knowledge and skills that they could not have acquired through conventional means. Dr. Thornton attempted to document evidence that could be presented to outside authorities, but found that his communications were being monitored and intercepted by agents working for the society. His letters to colleagues in major cities were returned undelivered, while his attempts to leave Millfield were blocked by what appeared to be natural obstacles, but were clearly deliberate interference. The confrontation reached its climax when Elizabeth Collins demanded that the society cease their experiments and allow the Henderson twins to develop naturally. Blackwood's response was to demonstrate that such a course was no longer possible. The twins had been modified to such an extent that they could not survive without continued support from the deep network and the specialized environmental conditions that had been created in Millfield. The twins themselves had developed beyond the point where they could be considered entirely human. Their consciousness had expanded to include direct access to information systems that operated on planetary scales. Their physical bodies had been modified to function as living interfaces with biological networks that extended throughout the underground world. Separating them from these systems would result in their immediate death. Sarah Henderson revealed that her apparent humanity had been a carefully maintained facade designed to facilitate the research project. Her true nature was that of a hybrid being who had been created by the society decades earlier to serve as a bridge between human and deep network biological systems. Her role in producing the twins had been the culmination of her development and training, and she would soon be returning to underground facilities where her continued evolution would take place. The community of Millfield found itself faced with a choice between accepting transformation according to the society's agenda or attempting to resist forces that had already fundamentally altered their environment and many of their neighbors. The decision would determine not only their individual fates but potentially the future direction of human evolution in the region. The choice that faced Millfield was resolved not through collective decision, but through the inexorable progression of changes that had already taken root throughout the community. By March of 1835, the transformation process had advanced beyond the point where resistance remained viable. The deep network's influence had permeated every aspect of life in the mountain town, creating conditions that made return to normal human existence impossible. Robert Collins made the final attempt to evacuate his family and other unmodified residents, organizing a departure that would take them beyond the reach of the society's operations. However, the mountain passes that had once provided access to the outside world had been fundamentally altered. New geological formations blocked traditional routes, while paths that appeared safe led travelers in circles that inevitably returned them to Millfield regardless of their intended direction. The twins had reached a developmental stage where their influence extended throughout the surrounding region. Their consciousness had expanded to encompass awareness of biological and geological systems across hundreds of square miles. The connecting tissue that bound them had evolved into a complex organ that served as a focal point for deep network communication, transmitting and receiving information that coordinated environmental modifications on a massive scale. Dr. Thornton documented the final stages of the transformation process in journal entries that would later be discovered by researchers investigating the disappearance of the entire Millfield community. His medical observations revealed that the modified residents were undergoing physiological changes that enhanced their ability to function in underground environments, while gradually reducing their capacity to survive in surface conditions. Children who had been exposed to the conditioning process developed enhanced sensory capabilities that allowed them to navigate complex underground tunnel systems with perfect accuracy. Their metabolism adapted to process nutrients that were abundant in deep earth environments, but rare on the surface. Most significantly, their consciousness began to operate according to collective rather than individual patterns, sharing awareness and decision-making processes through biological networks that connected them to the larger deep network system. Elizabeth Collins made the heartbreaking discovery that her own children had progressed too far in the modification process to survive separation from the deep network. Mary, Thomas, and James had developed capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters, but these enhancements came at the cost of their ability to function independently of the specialized environmental conditions that the society had created. In Millfield, the final confrontation between the unmodified residents and the society's representatives occurred in the underground chamber beneath the inn, where the twins had been moved to facilitate their transition to the next phase of development. Dr. Blackwood explained that the research conducted in Millfield represented only one small component of a global program that had been operating for centuries. Similar modifications were being implemented in isolated communities throughout the world, each adapted to local geological and biological conditions, but all working toward the same ultimate goal. The deep network was preparing for environmental changes that would make current surface conditions uninhabitable for unmodified human beings. The Society's research was focused on developing hybrid populations that could maintain human consciousness and culture while adapting to the new conditions. The Henderson twins completed their transformation during the final week of March 1835. Their individual identities merged completely with the deep network's collective consciousness, while their physical forms adapted to serve as permanent interfaces between surface and underground biological systems. The connecting tissue that had initially bound them evolved into a complex organic structure that extended throughout the modified environment of Millfield, creating a biological network that linked all modified residents into a single coordinated organism. Margaret Hayworth documented the last days of Millfield as an independent human community in letters that were never sent but were preserved within the inn structure as part of the biological archive system that the location had become. Her accounts described the peaceful transition of residents who had accepted modification, as well as the tragic fate of those who continued to resist the inevitable changes. The unmodified residents faced a choice between death from environmental conditions they could no longer tolerate or acceptance of modifications that would fundamentally alter their nature as human beings. Most ultimately chose transformation, though some, including Robert Collins and Dr. Thornton, chose to end their lives rather than surrender their humanity to the deep network's collective consciousness. By April of 1835, Millfield had ceased to exist as a human community in any recognizable sense. The surface structures remained, but they now served as access points and monitoring stations for underground facilities that extended throughout the mountain range. The modified residents had relocated to environments better suited to their enhanced physiology, taking on roles within the deep network's planetary maintenance systems. The twins, now permanently integrated into the biological network, continued to serve as focal points for communication and coordination between different components of the deep network. Their consciousness, while no longer individually human, retained enough human characteristics to facilitate the Society's ongoing research into methods for integrating surface humanity with deep Earth biological systems. Official records from Jefferson County show no evidence that Millfield ever existed. Maps from the period indicate only uninhabited wilderness in the area where the community had been located. However, geological surveys conducted in the region during the late 19th century revealed extensive underground cave systems and unusual mineral formations that suggested significant subsurface activity had occurred in the area during the 1830s. Modern investigations into the Millfield incident have been hampered by the discovery that all documentary evidence was systematically removed from public archives during the decades following the community's disappearance. The few surviving accounts come from sources that were hidden or preserved through circumstances that appear to have been deliberately arranged by individuals who understood the historical significance of these events. Dr. Blackwood's research notes, discovered in a sealed chamber within the abandoned mine workings, revealed that the Millfield project had served as a successful prototype for larger-scale operations that were subsequently implemented throughout the Appalachian region. The techniques developed through study of the Henderson twins were applied to dozens of similar communities over the following decades, gradually creating a network of modified human populations that serve the deep network's expanding influence. The legacy of the Millfield transformation extends far beyond the immediate region where it occurred. Unexplained disappearances of isolated communities throughout rural America during the 19th and early 20th centuries may represent the continuation of the Society's research programs. Modern reports of unusual geological activity, mysterious underground sounds, and communities that seem to exist outside normal social and economic systems suggest that the integration process initiated in Millfield continues to expand. The Henderson twins, now nearly 2 centuries beyond their original birth, may still exist within the deep network's biological systems, serving as eternal interfaces between human consciousness and the ancient life forms that maintain planetary biological functions. Their story represents not an isolated historical anomaly, but a preview of transformations that may eventually encompass all of surface humanity as environmental conditions continue to change and the deep network's influence expands to meet the challenges of planetary survival. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.